User management. During certain processes when you program, sometimes you might need to know which user you are working with, validate the user ID, look up the user ID and so on. And then you should know that there is a Codeunit you can use, Codeunit 4.18, user management. Let's have a look at that user management Codeunit. Here we have the user management Codeunit 4.18, in which we have a number of functions. One of those interesting functions is validate user ID. You can provide it with a username, and then this function will try to use that username to verify if it's a valid user, yes or no. Very similarly, there is also the lookup user ID function, which will call the lookup user function, and then this lookup user function based on the username can display you a page with users with similar names. So these are interesting functions to use. Validate username is also another example that we see in here. And there are many other interesting functions you can find. One would be, for example, rename records. And in that case, you can use that to rename certain records in different tables if you might need to change the user ID, for example. So I just want to mention this Codeunit. It contains some very interesting functions and examples on how you typically can work with user IDs and user names. The user setup table. During posting, sometimes you would like to fetch some information from the user setup. And typically in the user setup table, there are three different kinds of information that we can find in there. First, when is the user allowed to post transactions? Secondly, which responsibility center will the user work in? And whether the user's activities should be logged in a time register, yes or no. In our case, during posting, what we use is the allow posting from field in the user setup table to determine the earliest date as from which the user, in this case, is allowed to post. It's impossible for the user to post before that date. And the user setup actually has precedence over the general ledger setup. So let's have a look again at the code where this information, allow posting from, in the user setup table is verified. Here we are in our checkline Codeunits, and you might remember that in the run check function of the checkline Codeunits, one of the things that this Codeunit verifies is depending on the user ID. Using the user ID, we'll go here to the user setup table and we'll have a look at the values of the allow posting from and allow posting to fields in the user setup table. And we first do this before we go to the general ledger setup. So the user setup table has precedence over the general ledger setup table, and then this will determine whether the user is allowed to post yes and no. Within the application itself, you can also have a look for the user setup table. If you look for user setup, this is where you will find it. And the page surrounding this table displays the different users. You can always add new users in here if they are already users in the system. And here you can set the allow posting from and the allow posting to, which in this case the checkline Codeunit will verify. There are other fields that you can also enter in here, but for the posting procedures, it comes down to allow posting from and allow posting to. Now, the user setup table is also a table that you can extend. You can add fields in that table. You can also extend the page. And then when you program, you can also make use of the user setup table to enable or disable certain functionality if you would like to do that. Typically, the user setup table is used for these purposes. The source code setup table. The source code and the source code setup tables can specify where do entries come from. For example, if you have a look at the ledger entries and you would like to analyze where do the entries come from, there is typically a source code field available to determine and explain where does the customer ledger entry or the item ledger entry or whatever entry you are looking for come from. And what you typically do is you define different source codes in the source code table, and then you link a source code to a certain batch, job or process in the application using the source code setup. So in the source code setup you can say, well, for a sales journal I would like to use this source code, and then if you then encounter ledger entries with the source code X which you used for sales journal, then you know, okay, it comes from a sales journal. So typically the source code setup table contains all posting methods and the names of all of the batch, job and processes within the application. So let's have a look. In the application I will look for the words source code, and if you do that you can find two places, source codes and source code setup. So let me have a look at both of them. If I go to source codes, you will see a list of all of the source codes within the application. These are names, and in this list you can enter whatever information that you would like. You can add new source codes, and all that you will see in here is the code and a description. That's it. So this list you can manage, of course, yourself. If I go and have another look at source code, then I can also go here to the source code setup. And if I go to the source code setup, a setup page opens, and I can say, for example, if you will be doing something using a general journal, then this source code needs to be used. But on the other hand, if I'll be using a financial journal, like we see right here, then this is the source code that you need to use. And for sales and for purchase and so on and so on. So in the source code setup, you will link the source code to a certain process. And then, of course, you can also find that in the corresponding ledger entries. So as an example, here we are in the sales post Codeunit. And if I would here look up a source code, for example, then we notice that if I do that, there is a link here to the source code setup table in this variable. Now let's have a look at where this variable is used. What we notice is that we go to our setup tables. So in this case, right after we have locked our tables, we go to the setup table. We fetch in this case the source code setup for sales because we are in the sales post. And then we will store this into this variable source code. Later on, then this variable source code is used whenever we would like to, for example, create journal lines. As you notice, it is transferred here to those functions where we will be creating journal lines. If I would then do another look for source code, for example, you notice that whenever we create a journal line in the application, we use the source code to indicate where this journal line is coming from. So the posted documents, but also the journal lines are marked, so to speak, by making use of the source code field.